welcome Alex from Frontier Economics, who is going to give us a very interesting post-lunch discussion on the economics of climate resilience. Thank you.
Great. Thanks all for coming. Hopefully you've all had a lunchtime coffee and you're ready to discuss valuing the economic, social and environmental impacts of enhanced climate resilience. Is it okay? Yeah. Ooh. No. One more time. Tech problems give people time to find their seats. So yep. Great. So I guess a natural question is, why do we need to value climate resilience? We all know resilience is a good thing. Why don't we just invest in enhanced resilience and make sure our cities, communities, etc., can withstand climate events? So I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys, but decision making is subject to increasing challenges. And that's really why we're here talking about cost benefit analysis and demonstrating the value of doing things differently. So as the slide says, ensuring secure, reliable and cost-effective management of our blue, green and grey infrastructure, such as energy and water, is critical to support economic growth and to meet our community's growing expectations for livable and healthy environments. But like I said, decision making is subject to an increasing number of challenges, and some of those are up on the slide here. So they include things like urban population growth, aging and dependent infrastructure, climate change, which increases the risk of drought, floods, etc. Changes to community expectations. So communities are increasingly expecting that our cities are livable, cool, green environments and that we're not discharging sewage into the ocean, for example. And we also have increased risk of floods, fires, droughts, etc. So all of these factors mean that the decisions that we make need to be resilient to a range of different uncertainties. And the challenge is that if we don't take into account how resilient our cities and investments are, we're risking imposing additional economic, social and environmental costs on our communities. So on the slide, I have an example of Greater Sydney, and I should say this presentation talks generally about valuing climate resilience, but I'll use examples from the water sector and the energy sector just to give you a flavour for how we can apply this framework to multiple challenges. So on the slide, there are some charts of the water sector in Greater Sydney. So if you're not familiar with the water sector in Greater Sydney, the challenges are we have increased population growth forecast for Greater Sydney. So we need to make sure that we have resilient water supply that's available to meet population growth over the next 50 years. And that's the chart on the left-hand side. Demand is forecast to grow significantly. We need to make sure that we're in a position to meet that increased demand. However, as I mentioned, there are also these challenges related to climate change and drought, which means that we need to make sure that our water system are also resilient. And the chart on the right-hand side shows the rate at which storage is depleted during the previous 2 droughts. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just to highlight, you can see on the far right-hand side of that second chart that storage is depleted about 20% per year. And so there is a risk that they deplete quite quickly. And so we need to make sure that we're in a position to be resilient to that risk of it depleting. Just to, I guess, drill that point home, the reason that we care about that risk and managing that risk is that that will impose a range of economic, social, and environmental costs in our community. So as this slide shows, this is an example of the water sector and resilience to drought. So climate change may make drought spells more frequent and severe and less likely to follow historical inflow data. That has the impact in terms of requiring additional supply and demand measures to ensure reliability and resilience of the system. And that can impose a range of potentially significant economic, social, and environmental costs on water utilities, customers, and the broader community. And some examples are shown on the right-hand side of the slide, including the cost of those additional measures to manage the increased demand, but also to respond to drought if it occurs, the social and economic cost on residents and businesses from water restrictions or insufficient water supply during a drought, so a supply shortfall, increased heat-related mortality and morbidity and energy costs related to managing urban heat, environmental costs such as death of street trees and impacts on air quality, and reduced amenity and lost opportunities for recreation related to insufficient water supply. So you can see, even if we're just talking about climate change in the water sector, the impacts are far-reaching across the community. And importantly, they go beyond just the financial costs of an investment. So I guess then the natural question is, okay, what can we do to help address climate risks? Obviously, the solution that you take is going to depend on the climate risk that you're most concerned with. At its highest level, there are a range of proactive and reactive solutions available to managing climate risk. That includes things like pre-planning to enable you to respond to an event faster. So for example, planning a desal plant so you can build it faster in the risk of a drought. Operational solutions, including governance and financial arrangements, for example, insurance. Build infrastructure solutions, so ongoing investment to enable decision makers to scale up in the event of a climatic risk. That could be a seawall to prevent coastal inundation, could be building a desal plant outside of drought. And finally, there are also non-build infrastructure solutions. So for example, changing how an asset operates or changing customer behaviour. There are also a range of reactive solutions available. Many of those will be the same as proactive solutions. The difference is the actions that you take to respond to a climate event. So, for example, water restrictions in a drought, firefighting in the event of a fire, etc. In general, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. There's not going to be one solution that is always better than another. But at its highest level, we need to make sure that we are considering both proactive and reactive solutions when looking at managing climate risk and making sure that they feature in our analysis and our plans. So I guess the natural question is, if we know that there are climate risks, we know that there are measures available to help us address those risks, why are we here talking about valuing climate resilience? So I thought I might take a step to the side and talk a bit about funding investments. So I know obviously this is a cost-benefit analysis forum. We're talking about the value to the community, but cost-benefit analysis is closely related to how we go about funding our investment. And in the case of, water and energy utilities, often they're subject to economic regulation, and they need to demonstrate that the investments that they're making are in the best interest of their customers. So on the left-hand side, I have a quote from an economic regulator that says that they recognise that investment in climate resilience is necessary to meet the long-term interests of customers. So there is a recognition from economic regulators that often it makes sense to spend a bit more in the short term to help manage the risk of something occurring over the longer term. So the question is, how do we demonstrate to economic regulators, to internal decision makers, to New South Wales Treasury, that it makes sense to spend a bit more on climate resilience to help manage or minimise the economic, social and environmental risks of associated with climate risk. So, as it says on the slide, a material benefit of doing something, and therefore a material cost of business as usual, depends on the likelihood of a climatic event occurring. If we knew that a climate-related outage or flood or drought was to occur or not to occur with certainty, we could invest with certainty upfront. However, the likelihood is inherently uncertain, and there are various possible states of the world, and some examples are in the slide, ranging from a climatic event does not occur, so you don't incur those economic, social, and environmental costs of the climate risk, all the way to a climatic event occurs every year or multiple times a year. And obviously the impact of those events and the benefit of investing in resilience depends on which state of the world you're in, whether this event is going to occur or if it doesn't occur. And because increased resilience often comes at a higher upfront financial cost, we need to be able to identify and justify when and where we should invest in resilience. The challenge is, to add to the list of challenges, many of the benefits of resilience are non-monetary. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys that there are techniques available for us to value non-monetary impacts, but bear with me as I set up this story. So on the left-hand side, we have some of the economic costs and benefits of resilience, including the costs of the resilient solution, but also the avoided cost of repairing or replacing infrastructure in the event of a climate risk, the avoided cost of maintenance, the avoided cost of responding to an outage, so for example, cleanup costs, advertising costs, etc., and also the avoided cost of triggering investment to manage that risk. But as I said, many of these benefits are also non-monetary. So on the right-hand side, there are some examples of social and environmental cost and benefits of enhanced resilience, such as the avoided cost to customers of energy outages, if we're talking about the energy sector, the avoided cost of water restrictions or a supply shortfall, so insufficient water supply during a drought, the avoided mortality and morbidity associated with water quality-borne diseases, if we're talking about resilience to water quality issues, and then some more common cost and benefits, the opportunity cost of land, amenity impacts, for example. So this slide is not meant to be an exhaustive list of resilience impacts. It's really just there to highlight that there are a range of potential impacts. And so we need a framework that enables us to consider the value of these non-monetary impacts under uncertainty. However, relative to business as usual, identifying the value of these resilience investments can be seen as more challenging, as there are potentially a broad suite of actions that we could take or levels of service or resilience that we could target. So it can be challenging to know where to start. How much resilience is too much resilience? What level of service should we be targeting when we think about delivering services to our customers? Often the causal link between the action and final outcomes are a complex multiple-step process, especially when we are dealing with things that are non-monetary. It's very rare that your investment leads to an instantaneous change in an outcome, and that's what you're concerned about in a cost-benefit analysis. Often it's investment in pre-planning enables me to build something faster in a drought, which means that I have more water available, which means that people won't be subject to water restrictions. And it's ultimately the cost of water restrictions that we're trying to value in our cost-benefit analysis. I've said it a few times that the benefits are often non-monetary, so we need to be in a position to convert them into a dollar figure. And then I guess stepping a bit away from cost-benefit analysis specifically, there may be a range of other reasons why resilience investments can be seen as more challenging to demonstrate the value of. For example, there may be an internal bias towards more reactive approaches to managing risk. It's how things have been done traditionally. People are comfortable with that approach, and so why do we need to be looking at more resilient solutions, for example? The benefits are often dispersed across the community and across time, which can create challenges in terms of valuing them, but also in terms of seeking funding from those parties if that's a relevant consideration. And finally, the costs are often locked in, whereas the benefits depend on whether key climatic risks occur. So the combined impact of these factors means it can be seen to be more difficult or risky to justify investment, both internally and externally, which can result in attention being focused on other more immediate priorities. So given these challenges, what can we do to make sure that we are improving our understanding of the value of resilience and investing where it makes sense? So as the slide says, there has been movement towards improving our understanding of the value of resilience, and this is kind of across Australia, but also across different sectors. So in the New South Wales water sector, for example, DQ recently released their New South Wales water conservation CBA guidelines, which provide sector-specific guidance on undertaking CBA, and they're currently being updated to include recycled water and stormwater with a specific focus on resilience. The QCA, which is the Queensland Competition Authority, recently released a paper outlining how it would consider the value of resilience. And finally, in the energy sector, the AEMC recently introduced a rule change which requires the regulator to develop sector-specific guidance around how it would evaluate investments in resilience. So as a whole, as a country, we are moving towards strengthening our ability to value resilience, and we've been working with a range of government clients to help fill those gaps. And I'll talk a bit about that work on the following slides. So as the slide says, how can economics help us value climate resilience? So as I mentioned, we've been working with a range of different clients to help develop frameworks to enable us to value the cost and benefits of enhanced resilience. And that's across the water sector, but also the energy sector, for example. And at its heart, it's a 5-step process that is hopefully familiar because it follows the 5 steps of cost-benefit analysis. The first is identifying the appropriate base case and alternative options. The second is identify, quantify, and monetize the relevant costs and benefits of the base case and alternative options. Step 3 is identify the incremental value of each option. Step 4 is to consider risk and uncertainty. And step 5 is to identify the distribution of costs and benefits of improved resilience across the community. I didn't include this slide as a lesson in CBA for you guys. I'm sure you know what's involved in CBA, but really to highlight that the steps of valuing resilience are the same as the steps in CBA. It's the same process, it just might require a bit more additional information on the likelihood of different outcomes occurring. So, as I mentioned, a key step in CBA is understanding the value of risk and uncertainty, and that's even more important when we talk about the value of resilience because it does depend on the likelihood of outcomes occurring. So there are a range of different techniques, as I'm sure you're aware, related to valuing risk and uncertainty and cost-benefit analysis, ranging from sensitivity analysis on the left-hand side, which is on the left-hand side in the lower level of complexity, all the way up to real options analysis and adaptive pathways analysis on the right-hand side. The applicability of these techniques is going to vary depending on your project. Often when we're dealing with things like resilient investments, you're looking at things at a minimum that look at expected net present value because you want to make sure that you're accounting for the likelihood or risk of different impacts occurring. We're not in the world of a standalone NPV BCR. You want to make sure that you are looking at the expected value of your project. But there might also be a role for even more complex forms of risk and uncertainty, such as adaptive pathways and real options analysis, which values the benefit of flexibility to respond to risk and uncertainty and change your behaviour as new information becomes available. And if there's sufficient time, I'll talk a bit through an example of that. So as part of the work that we've done for our clients around Australia, we've identified a formula for each cost and benefit under uncertainty. So at its heart, it sounds really simple, but it typically involves a price times a quantity times the likelihood. We often use this formula when we're talking to non-economists because I think it is an easy way to understand what we're trying to do. Rest assured, there is complexity that sits behind it. So for example, when we're talking about valuing economic, social and environmental costs and benefits, it's the price in terms of the value the community places on the change in outcomes, multiplied by the change in economic, social and environmental outcomes, multiplied, very importantly, by the change in the likelihood of the outcome occurring if relevant. So for example, the likelihood of an outage or the likelihood of restrictions. And this framework, although simple, can be applied to the full range of economic, social and environmental costs and benefits of resilience across the range of sectors. It's not just applicable to energy and water that I mentioned. So I have a few examples in the following slides. So this is an example of valuing the avoided cost of long-term outages in the energy sector. So In case you're not familiar with resilience in the energy sector, the top half of this slide has an example of how an investment can lead to an impact on customers, and it's that impact on customers that we're ultimately trying to value as part of our CBA. So starting from the left, network resilience investments may reduce the likelihood of long-term power outages relative to business as usual. This is particularly the case for weather and climate-related outages, which is what we're talking about today. Less frequent long-term power outages across the network improves the reliability of energy supply to all customer types. And a more reliable energy supply will avoid productivity, inconvenience, discomfort, and appliance damage costs associated with unserved energy, in particular the impacts of long-term outages. So the reason I've included that causal link up the top of the slide, A, is to help explain what we're talking about when we talk about the avoided cost of long-term outages, and B, to highlight another key part of the CBA framework, which is the role of qualitative assessment. So as much as I'd like to think we can value everything in CBA, often we can't. And so being able to articulate the causal link between your investment and the change in outcomes is really important. And it can be used in instances where the information may not be available to enable you to put a monetary value on resilience benefits. So on the bottom half of the slide, there's an example of one of the P times Q times L formulas. So in the energy sector, there is the value of network reliability, which is the price that we apply in this particular instance. The change in quantity is the change in unserved energy. And we're multiplying it by the change in the likelihood of an outage. And obviously, to access this kind of information relies on working with the experts in the field, so the energy businesses, etc., to access information on how the investment could lead to changes in the risk of an outage. So as I've been saying throughout this presentation, central to valuing resilience benefits is understanding the likelihood of climate risks. And I have an example, a very simplified example in terms of the likelihood of a storm outage. So if, for example, the likelihood of a storm event is 25% per year, the expected number of storm events over the modelling period will be 7.5 storm events or outages. If we can reduce that likelihood to 5% per year, the expected number of storm events or outages will be 1.5 over the modelling period. Obviously, this is a simplified example, but it shows you how this likelihood can feed into the analysis and help inform that valuation formula. Helpfully, we don't need to be 100% certain of the likelihoods. We can use a range of techniques, including sensitivity and scenario analysis, to test different likelihoods, and break-even analysis to help us answer how likely would the event have to be, or how much would the likelihood have to change for my investment to stack up. Similarly, the same framework can be applied to resilience in the water sector. So I have an example of a causal link, on this slide that relates to investment in water conservation. So you can see that investment in water conservation, like water efficient shower heads, can reduce potable water demand, which can slow the rate at which our storages or dams deplete, which reduces the risk of water restrictions or a supply shortfall. And that same P times Q times L high-level formula can be applied here, except the price that we're applying is the community's willingness to pay to avoid restrictions, multiplied by the change in restricted demand, multiplied by the change in the probability of restrictions or a supply shortfall. Similar to the energy example, we need to understand the likelihood of climatic risks occurring. So on this slide, I have some examples of the rates at which storages deplete. I thought it was interesting to include two kind of examples. The first is where a system is relatively secure. So you can see the green represents where we're spending most of our time. Most of the time in the system on the left is spent at high levels. It's secure. The risks of getting to those low levels where we impose severe restrictions or have a supply shortfall is very low. And so when we apply that P times Q times L formula, the likelihood is going to be fairly low. The value might be fairly low. So if our system looks like the left, it may not be worth spending more to reduce the risk of that outcome occurring because the risk is already relatively low. In contrast, if our system looks more like the right-hand side, where you can see basically over the next 5 years, we're going to hit very low storage levels. In this instance, it might make sense to spend money on a more resilient supply because the risks that we're managing are quite likely. So again, highlighting the need to bring in that likelihood into the analysis. We're not dealing with a world where these risks will happen. We're dealing with a world where they might happen, and the actions that you take can reduce that risk of it occurring. So as I mentioned, I was going to quickly talk about more complex forms of risk and uncertainty if there was enough time. So the examples that I've talked to date really relate to expected net present value. So bringing that likelihood in, building on kind of more traditional cost benefit analysis. For more complex projects that are usually larger or subject to more risk, there might be a role for more complex forms of risk and uncertainty like real options analysis. So on this slide, I have an example of a real options analysis tree as it relates to undergrounding. So if your first kind of question is, do I invest in undergrounding, which is putting power lines underground to enhance the resilience of the energy sector? You might say, no, I'm not going to spend that money. I don't think the risk of a storm event is particularly high. I'm just going to keep doing business as usual. So you're on the top half of the tree. Then the question is, does a storm event occur? If it doesn't, life's rosy, it's business as usual, and your present value of that outcome is 120 million. However, we know from the tree that there is a risk that a storm event does occur. Power lines might go down. It takes you a while to respond. You're really stuck in a world of a reactive approach to storm management. And in that instance, the NPV of that particular option is minus 250 million because you're incurring costs associated with restoring power, but also the social and environmental costs of insufficient energy supply. So when we take into account the risk of that storm event occurring, the payoff of that branch is minus 28 million. So even though if the world was perfect, we didn't have any storm events, it would make sense to do business as usual. And when we take into account the likelihood of that storm event occurring, it delivers a net benefit to society of minus 28 million. In contrast, you might be back at your decision and say, actually, I do want to invest in undergrounding. I know that there is a risk of storm events happening. Let me spend a bit upfront to underground my power lines so they're resilient to climate risk. Similarly, to the top half of the branch, there's the risk that the storm event occurs. If it doesn't occur, you've incurred that additional expenditure upfront and you didn't need to respond to that storm event. So the payoff of 2A is less than 1A because you've incurred that additional expenditure. However, in the event that the storm event does occur, 2B, you have a much more resilient system. The cost of managing that risk are much lower. And so the NPV of that particular option is 90 million. And when you take 2A and 2B together and account for the likelihood of the different outcomes occurring, the payoff of that branch is 60 million. So in this particular instance, because of the risk of a storm event, it makes sense to spend a bit more upfront to help you manage that risk. Obviously, all of these numbers are for illustrative purposes only, and this is a simplified example, so implementing this technique in practice is a bit more complicated, but it's really designed to help illustrate how this kind of thinking can be useful and how valuing the benefits of flexibility can be quite helpful when we're talking about resilience analysis. As the right-hand side of the slide says, it's not always going to be helpful to apply real options analysis and adaptive pathways analysis. It can be more time consuming and data intensive. So you really want to use it when investments can be broken down into multiple stages. Some or all of the stages are irreversible. There are material differences in the value of the options depending on that uncertainty. The investment or decision plan can be altered as new information comes to light. If you can't respond to the climate event, doing real options analysis isn't very helpful because it values the benefits of flexibility to respond to events. So just quickly, so I guess we've talked about why we need to value climate resilience and how economics can help us value climate resilience. I thought it would be helpful if we take it back to one of the quotes I had at the beginning of the presentation, which was, how do economic regulators view investment in resilience? So we talked about demonstrating that a higher cost solution delivers value to customers because over the long term, it could be a lower cost solution when you're taking into account risk. And here is just a visual example of, I guess, that happening in practice. So if number one is just the cost of the core service and the absence of risk, so that might be the payoff of that 1A in the decision tree. If we knew that risk wasn't going to occur, that climate risk wasn't going to occur, this is the cheapest way of delivering our services. We know that we can incur a bit more upfront to help us manage that climate risk, so it's going to be a higher cost solution with enhanced resilience for number two. So the question is, when does it make sense to spend a bit more to manage enhanced resilience? And in this case, it makes sense because when we consider the cost of managing that high cost, low probability event, the total cost of delivering services in a BAU manner outweigh number two. So the sum of 1 and 3 is greater than number 2. And really that's what the regulator is interested in when we're talking about demonstrating value to customers, being able to demonstrate that your higher cost solution is actually lower cost over the life of the asset, given the presence of risk and uncertainty. So I appreciate that's a whirlwind tour of value and resilience. So I thought I might just leave you with what's next. So obviously development of these guidance around how you value resilience is a step in the right direction, but it's not the end of the journey. So there's a need to continue to harness the power of economic valuation techniques and work collaboratively across disciplines to build knowledge and data sets. And forums like today are really important because it enables us to share knowledge across sectors and learn from what other people are doing in different areas. There's also a need for us to improve our understanding of the likelihood of climate risks occurring. Even though the analysis doesn't require you to know with certainty the likelihood of something occurring, the analysis is strengthened if you have a better understanding of those climate risks that you're dealing with. And also finally, the impact of those climate risks. So we can talk about the cost of having no water or having no power, but improving our understanding of the community's willingness to pay to avoid those costs and what actually happens when you do have no water and no power is really crucial for demonstrating the value of investing to reduce that risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We have 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has any.
Hey, I'm Guri from DQ. I just had a question on using the willingness to pay to value the benefit. Are there any alternative approaches, for example, using the damage costs? And are there any limitations or advice you have on that?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what you're trying to value. So there are going to be instances where the damage cost is appropriate. So when you're talking about the avoided cost of rebuilding property in response to a flood, obviously damage cost is a really crucial metric to value that impact. I guess I would just say we don't want to just focus on the financial costs. So even if we're talking about a flood and avoiding the impact of a flood, we want to capture the avoided damage costs, but also, for example, the avoided mental health costs of a flood, the avoided damage to agriculture if we're flooding an agricultural area, etc. So I would say kind of as a blanket statement, the technique that you use is going to differ depending on what you're trying to value. Obviously, willingness to pay studies are limited, especially if you're dealing with benefit transfer to the studies that we already have available. Often we don't have enough time to undertake our own studies. So it's a question of what studies are out there that relate to what I'm trying to value. Can I use that to give me an idea about the materiality of the thing I'm valuing and potentially make the case as to why we need to do further analysis? So yeah, I wouldn't say it's a one size fits all for every metric, and it also depends on, do you have a willingness to pay study that you can draw upon easily? For things like environmental values, often they are the best thing that we have available if we want to go beyond just the cost of replacing the environment, for example.
Hi, I'm Alistair Robs from Essential Energy, which is a DNSP, and I'm actually an economist looking at how to value network resilience. So some of the experiences I've had on the ground talking with people, the engineers, one way that we come up with these likelihoods is looking back at the past, because that's all we've got. Now, here's the problem, as you know, a lot of these climate risks are in the future when those, what happened in the past 10 or 20 years, we can be fairly confident they'll happen more often. So that's why when you said there's a lot more work, that there is a lot more work to go from a lot of this high level down to, well, okay, this is what happened in the past 10, 20 years. This is what it might be in the future. And it sort of plays into when you've got a list of possible projects you're going to spend on your network or whatever, some might be for long term or some short term. And in short term, we've got a bit more confidence about those likelihoods. So as we all often know, it's human nature to attach a bit more weight to confidence. So I'm wondering, are you looking at in the future how to do that more work down to the more granular level about, well, okay, what are the chances or likelihoods these are happening, looking for the next 10, 20 or 30 years, because some of our assets are 80 years old. And that's what I was saying in a previous session upstairs. I'm not going to be around in 80 years, although I'm going to be asked to pay for a lot of these. This is going to some more fundamental CBA questions, the evaluation. I'm being asked to pay for something that I won't get the full benefits for. It's a fundamental question. When you ask consumers how much are you willing to pay, they pay most of the upfront cost, which is typical of big infrastructure investment. But a lot of the benefits will be skewed to their children, which they might have some altruistic benefits for. So could that result in perhaps a suboptimal expenditure on some of these climate-related investments?
I guess I would say that there can be a bias towards kind of more short-term solutions because they are better understood. We are more biased towards things that we have greater confidence in. I guess the challenge is these risks are real. And we do, on our day-to-day lives, deal with risk and make expenditure to manage risks all the time. Like we purchase insurance to manage something that may or may not happen. So I guess part of the reason why we wanted to have this discussion is that, yes, there is obviously a bias towards things that are more certain, but we need to be having these discussions about managing the risk of things occurring. In terms of your comment related to improving our understanding of risk, as much as I would like to say economics solves everything, it definitely doesn't. And so there is a real role for working alongside climate scientists, etc., who I know are doing a lot of work in the energy sector, to improve our ability to forecast storm events. Yeah, exactly. And I guess in terms of your question, your comment around funding, like the idea with the regulatory frameworks is to help address the fact that the assets are long-lived, so spread the costs over the life of the asset. That doesn't change the fact that there might be a bias internally towards more less risky solutions though. Yeah.
Lucy Thompson. My question was about what climate scenarios are you taking to be the base case? Are you doing different sensitivity analysis for the different potential climate scenarios as well as, you know?
I mean, yes, you can. So I guess depending on who we're working for and depending on where they're located, for example, or if they're a government department and they have to adopt a certain climate scenario, we'll use the climate scenario that's required and really sits behind their analysis. But sensitivity analysis is really important there because obviously the climate is uncertain. So you can run sensitivity analysis then. We also often work with water utilities who might develop their estimates of their inputs based on a range of different climatic scenarios, so bringing in that analysis as well. As I said, obviously, I don't come up with all the inputs, so often we are reliant on the best available climatic information. Yeah.
Hannah, thank you for the presentation. I just wondered if there's much work with other
developed economies who are also facing kind of the same questions and trying to bake in increased risk of climate change in infrastructure investment. Yeah, is it joined up thinking? Is it kind of Australia led?
There's definitely similar work happening elsewhere. Obviously, the climate risks that people are grappling with will vary. So I know in Singapore, for example, they're very focused on coastal inundation, and a lot of work in that space has really been focused on improved resilience there, whereas in Australia, we're really just starting the discussion around inundation. I think in terms of Australia, because we do have so many climate risks, there's either too much water or not enough water. We are at the forefront in many instances, and I do think that there's an opportunity for us to kind of share how economics can help feed into these discussions more broadly.
Yeah, we got a call from Iceland a while ago on a client engagement, so that's why I asked. 100% big opportunity for us.
If there are no other, follow-up question.
Just another question. How do you sort of account for the potential for maladaptation in some of the resilience measures that you're putting into place?
Can you give an example?
The Victorian desalination plant that was put in, and then
You mean like a white elephant type thing?
I haven't heard that term, but where it was put in to deal with the droughts, but then wasn't really used, so then it was a waste of money.
So I guess, so I wouldn't say the end bit. So I would say that just because you invest in something to reduce the risk of something the outcome occurring and if the outcome doesn't occur, it doesn't mean that it was a waste of money, because obviously we're always investing under uncertainty. And if I use the insurance example again, like we take out health insurance all the time to help us manage if we have poor health, but the fact that I haven't needed to go to hospital to me is not a waste of money. Similarly with the desal example, yes, we did invest in it and it hasn't necessarily been needed to address severe water restrictions since then, but it has performed other roles. So it's helped restore storages. It does provide water, I guess, outside of drought. And so to me, the fact that a climate event doesn't occur doesn't mean that something's a waste of money. It's about reframing kind of the question. And also, I guess, about a level of risk aversion. So do you want to take the risk that this event does occur when it imposes such significant costs on the community? Yep.
Where they're an adaptation measure, but they've got unintended consequences. Is there any way to sort of factor that in by putting a cost on these consequences that you maybe
definitely
be able to see?
Yeah. So you want to be, I guess, because I'm definitely not making the case where you should invest in all resilience ever. There's going to be instances where it does make sense and potentially instances where it doesn't. And if your solution can reduce the risk of inundation, but it imposes environmental costs, it may not make sense if the area that you're inundating doesn't have a large population growth, etc. So the idea is that these techniques help you weigh up those decisions. So I'm protecting a densely populated area from being inundated by seawater, but I'm impacting the environment. How do I kind of make that decision? And obviously, cost-benefit analysis isn't perfect, but it's another source of information to help have those kind of discussions, whereas at the moment we talk about it potentially conceptually about how you can reduce that risk, but being able to have some kind of monetary value on it, I think, is a step in the right direction.
Wonderful. I think we've used our time. Everybody, please join me in thanking Alex.
Thank you.